All right, now we can start. So I'm Margaret Levy, and I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, which is where you are, in case you weren't sure. And I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this event. This is the first of our annual symposia. We have 3 of them during the year. And the theme this year, obviously, is on technology and society and how it affects us as humans. I want to thank a couple of people who are here. First of all, this is co-sponsored with Catalyst for Collaborative Solutions, which is supported by the School of Engineering. Mark Horowitz is the director of Catalyst. Jennifer Whittam is the Dean of Engineering and on the advisory board of Catalyst. And Gar Soliner from the Business School is also on the advisory board and our liaison for our particular piece of this project. So thank you all for being here and for your support. We have another important person and people here. The 3 people next to me are all fellows at the center this year, and they're fellows supported by the Berggruen Institute. They're Berggruen Fellows. Nicholas Berggruen, the chairman of the Berggruen Institute, is right here. And Niels Gilman, just raise your hand, who's the vice president of programs, is here, and there's some other Berggruen people here as well. So thank you, Berggruen Institute, as well for your support. Let me just say a word or two about CASBS. I think most of you know it, but we also have a live stream audience who may be new. We just had a moth come through, very large one. This center is over 60 years old. The last 10 years it's been part of Stanford, but before that it was independent. It's always been a place that has attracted. It's the second institute for advanced study in the world, but the first one to really put together this kind of fellowship program that we have here, which brings together great minds, really deep thinkers from a whole variety of disciplines, mostly in the social sciences, but as you can see, not only in the social sciences, to really get a chance to reflect and think about major societal challenges. As we've evolved over those 60 years, we now focus much more than we did initially, not only on the individual projects, but also on a number of large-scale, ongoing, collaborative projects that are really taking on central societal issues, such as the ones we're going to be addressing tonight. During the period when CASBS has been around, we've had 26 Nobel laureates come through our doors, often before they became Nobel laureates. We like to say we can pick them. We've had 23 Pulitzers. I think your first fellowship overlapped with your getting a Pulitzer, is that right? So we have one of the Pulitzers here. We have hundreds of members of National Academy of Science, Medicine, and Engineering. Arthi and I are both part of that group. And we've had several clergy, the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi being our latest addition. So what we're going to do tonight is really think about some deep questions on technology and society, particularly thinking about the ways in which they impact humans, the way in which society is affected, and what our responsibility is as society and humans. It's going to be a conversation for about 45 minutes with John Markoff, Arthi Prabhakar, and Tenzin Priyadarshi, and me, sort of trying to represent the social sciences here. And then we'll open it up to questions. So I think I'll start by just I always throw out too broad a question, but that's okay because they really know how to just talk about what they want to talk about anyway and have a conversation. So it shouldn't be a problem. But I'd like us to start by thinking about what the impact of these new technologies have been on a variety of human activities, like work, the way we think. John ran a series on the impact of the iPhone, for example, at the Computer History Museum, and there's a project here on the internet generation and how it's forming values. So pick one, and let's just get started in the conversation.
Dive in. Who wants to go first? Well, I'll go first, just on the puzzle of pace. Because, I've grown up here in Silicon Valley, and for the last decade, I've been writing about artificial intelligence. And, I've also been around long enough to see the field fail before. I was around for the first AI winter. And now we're in this period where the general consensus is that we're in this period of acceleration, and also the consensus in Silicon Valley seems to be that it's going to absolutely transform society. And there are people in Silicon Valley who, for example, believe that by 2045 there will be no job that a machine won't be able to do. That's the sort of the fringe. And at the same time, I'm repeatedly struck by how much stuff actually remains the same. So there's a puzzle there. For example, right now in this country, there are about 159 million people working, almost as much as in history. So we've had 70 years of the integrated circuit. We've had a half a century of the microprocessor, and we have more people working than ever. And it's kind of one of those Rocky and Bullwinkle things, but Bullwinkle, that trick never works. This time for sure. Machine learning is going to change everything. We're going to go from this situation where there's clearly dislocation to rapid job destruction. And I just run into example after example where things actually tend to stay the same rather than jobs disappearing at a great rate. My favorite recent example of this, Hal Varian, the chief economist of Google, was up here for lunch last week, and he brought this slide deck. And he was actually citing James Beson's work. James Beson is an economist at Boston University. In 1950, there were 270 SIC codes. How many have gone away since then? One. Elevator operator is no longer an SIC code. So that's really a remarkable fact to me. Only 32 of those codes have seen declining employment. And so something is going on, but I'm still to this date a firm Keynesian. Keynes said in 1930 that automation destroys jobs and not work, and maybe someday it will be different. But I think what we're seeing right now is great change and dislocation. But overall, I don't see the kind of whirlwind of attack of technology that's going to make humans obsolescent.
Yep.
I'll take a completely different tack on. I think there's a world of interesting avenues to explore around work, because I think how that change is going to happen is very interesting. I'm really intrigued by the question of how we think of ourselves as humans and what authenticity is as we become more and more interconnected with our technologies. Let me give you a really extreme example that's from a research setting, maybe just to draw you forward. One of the really interesting areas that we were working on in my time at DARPA was neurotechnology. Really now we have the ability to get very, very precise measurements in real time of neural signals, and even more amazing, we now are starting to have the ability to translate them in real time into an understanding of what it is that the brain is trying to do. And in some of the very early experiments that we did in this area, the first few patients that we were able to work with, one of the volunteers was a woman named Jan. She was an individual who'd been paralyzed from the neck down for a number of years. And because of these amazing advances in technology, she was able to get a small implant on her motor cortex and was picking up her neural signals. We were able to translate those in real time so that she could think, and just by thinking, she could control a mechanical arm. And it was really amazing to just watch something like that happening. And she could do fairly sophisticated things. She could shake hands, she could do a fist bump, she could offer a visitor a stack of cookies. She ate chocolate. She fed herself chocolate for the first time in years. That was one of the things she was excited about. So that in itself was quite remarkable. But then the next step I thought was even more amazing, because the program manager at DARPA who was doing that program got together with another program manager at DARPA who was thinking about how machines might further augment that kind of mind-controlled motion. And if you look, Jen, she could do a lot of things, but a lot of her what she couldn't do was fine motor control. And so when she just tried to think about, for example, moving a block from point A to point B, it was sort of hard to get the fingers to do the right thing. Sometimes she would pick it up and make it, and sometimes it would drop along the way. And the new element that we introduced in the experimentation, as these two crazy program managers put their heads together, was to have machine automation that would do the vision recognition and recognize what it was that she was trying to grasp, and then feed that into the motor control so that she would make the gross movements, but then that fine motor control would be mediated by this machine that was figuring out what needed to be done. And it was quite remarkable because when you flipped that extra boost on, you could see all of a sudden Jan could just beautifully move these blocks with great precision. The thing that really blew me away, though, is she didn't think that was the machine doing that. She thought she was able to do that. Because, of course, she gets better over time. And so it felt so authentic to her that you really couldn't tell where the line was between her intent and what the machine was doing. And I think that's an extreme example out of research, but in a sense, we're all experiencing that even in our day-to-day adventures. You're having dinner with someone, and in the old days, you'd argue about a scene in a movie, and you'd have like 20 minutes of debate about it, but now someone whips out their smartphone, and they're augmented by a machine, and where does their knowledge end? I think
we know that John's favorite film is Her.
Yeah, I'm actually with him on that. I think that's...
Take us down a very different path.
Yeah, that's an interesting path.
Well, I'm trying to raise that it's not always a sanguine story here. Jensen, you want to get a word in here?
I think, I'll try to sort of segue a bit in a slightly different direction. And my concern is primarily around the ethical framework. We human beings are quite funny creatures in that regard. So, when you talk about intelligence, you have to also talk about, do we actually understand human intelligence optimally to be able to replicate or create certain coding around it? And efficiency, calculation, functionality, there are different sort of buckets of understanding sort of human intelligence. So let me give you 3 scenarios. One is, so a colleague of mine, last year we got curious about these self-driving cars, and so he did a experience sampling project where basically trying to understand, how would humans make decisions in self-driving system. And so they collected about a few million decision points from individuals all over the place. And, it was sort of creating complex scenarios, but based on an internet sort of model where people would make a decision based on, age demographics, wealth demographics, who should the self-driving car hit versus who should they choose to spare, and so on. And by far, you will see individuals would make utilitarian decisions. And then there was this one scenario where the idea was that you could either hit and kill 5 people, or the car could self-destruct by killing the owner of the vehicle. And by and large, most people actually opted for that. They said, yes, that's a wonderful idea that the car should actually self-destruct rather than killing 5 individuals. However, I would not buy the car, but others should. Let me give you another scenario. So I was working with a Japanese automotive company on sort of looking at ethical design, which is much of my work these days. And it was, again, one of these issues that how should self-driving car make a decision? So you have, the car is going straight. On the right side, you have a guy in a motorbike wearing a helmet. On the left side, you have a guy in a motorbike not wearing a helmet. And the idea was that, the car is going to hit a block. It needs to swerve to the right or to the left to save itself. Which way should it swerve? Now, if you run the scenario in the US, most people would say the car should swerve to the right because the guy is wearing a helmet and it would sort of cause less damage. The individuals in Asia mostly said, no, the car should swerve to the left because that guy is already breaking the rule. So why should you punish the guy who's actually following the rule and breaking the helmet, and wearing the helmet? So the thing is that, you have to start to think about that we culturally and otherwise make decisions radically differently. So even a simple thing, and I say it's simple thing in terms of the kinds of things we are about to design, like a self-driving car needs to go through all these kinds of considerations. And yes, we may pick a convenient rule, but that convenient rule might hit a blockage. And that's one of the things about ethics and technology. You see, the relationship thus far has been that you design and deploy. Something goes wrong, you start talking about ethics. You start talking about what could have been done, what can be done in the future, and so on. But the way we are approaching technology and at the scale, at the rate we are approaching, especially with AI and stuff, part of the challenge becomes is the magnitude of errors could be such large that it might be too late or too expensive to think about ethical considerations at that stage in time. Right? The last thing that just to touch base is also the notion of what a human life is worth. So we can talk about, of course, the value of work and what does it mean for a human being not to work. My colleagues at Vatican remind me that, work was given to humans as a punishment. But we take delight in punishments. That's why I said we are funny creatures that way. But our sense of identification with work is primarily sort of post-industrial revolution, But it has so deeply seeped into our psyche that today we get depressed when we don't have work. Right? Even when we are retired, we like to tell people that we are active in retirement, that we are working. So part of the thing is the psychological repercussions that would happen. So I'm not so much worried about economics as well. I am, slightly. But I'm more worried about the mental well-being of an individual and the state of well-being of society. The last thing I would touch on is war. The combination of AI and automation, one of the industries that is going to take precedence is AI in the battlefield. One of the first groups, perhaps, that would get replaced is the infantry. One of the deterrents today, yes, cost is a bit of deterrence. One of the real deterrents today is human life, cost of human life, for any country, for any country to enter into a war zone. When you have most of your infantry replaced by some form of robots, are we going to be willing to be entering into war more readily? Would it be sort of the first thing on our mind to do that? What would be the deterrence if cost is not an issue, you see? So those are the things that sort of in the long term are things that I think about and concerns me in the large framework.
I want to pick up on the point about war because having spent the last 4.5 years at DARPA thinking about this next generation of technology and what it was going to mean for war, I think was very central to a lot of our work. I don't think you have to look to the future, and I think the answer to your question is yes, it does change the calculus. In fact, if you look back over the last half century or so, the biggest shift in U.S. military doctrine and tactics has been a shift from mass to precision, and that it has had, like every powerful technology shift, it's had both good and bad effects. When you read today about the numbers of deaths in a conflict that the U.S. is involved in using precision weapons, the collateral damage has shrunk so dramatically compared to a conflict like Vietnam, for example. And more at the geopolitical scale, when we went into Iraq in the early 90s and showed the world what precision combat looked like after this very fundamental shift had taken place, what happened on that battlefield, I believe, has shaped the behavior of nation-state adversaries around the world for many, many years, of Russia, of China, of Iran, of North Korea. And so it has had many important, in some regards, there has been some very significant progress from those advances. And absolutely, it has also lowered the barrier to entry into conflict for a series of presidents and senior leaders.
There's another line we have to worry about crossing. Precision is one thing that may save lives, but we're bumping up against the question of autonomous killing machines. And that, the United States has crossed that and come back, and we're bumping up against it both in large-scale battle weapons like LRASM, something that came from your agency, long-range anti-ship missile, which is a missile that flies as a swarm over the horizon. It's considered a semi-autonomous weapon because a human targets the enemy fleet. But the actual killing decisions are made by the weapon system when it gets to the enemy fleet. And so you're right up against that decision that machines are going to make.
Just to be really clear, the machine is making a decision among a set of targets that humans have selected, right? And these are exactly the kinds of fine details that I think become incredibly important. I mean, really, that is the central decision, right? Is who actually has the authority in a time of conflict to determine that something is a target. Yeah. And I spent a lot of my time at DARPA explaining to senior military leaders that yes, these advances in technology, especially AI, are going to advance capabilities in some incredibly important ways. And at the same time, they're not these technologies aren't omniscient, and just to sort of maybe peel back one of the technical areas, we have a lot of smart technologists in the audience, but to me a key element of this machine learning generation of AI technology is that while these technologies can be statistically better than humans at various classification tasks, image classification included, statistically better does not mean perfect, and when they make mistakes, they make the kinds of mistakes that no human would ever make. And we've all seen funny examples of that. But when it's if it's a statistical problem, like classifying images in my photo library, that's great. But if it's a self-driving car making a critical decision or an autonomous weapon making a decision, those are genuinely life and death decisions. And we are, even if it's statistically more powerful than the human decision-making process, I just wanted to be very clear with senior military people that these technologies aren't ready to be just.
But it isn't just about the military, right? I mean, these kinds of problems that's part of what you're arguing. They're pervasive. So Cathy O'Neill's New York Times op-ed today was about the ways in which the algorithms are under human control, but we're not taking responsibility for them.
I think the challenge is distributed moral agency. You see, the thing is that, as a society, we are used to sort of attributing moral agency or responsibility to particular individuals, a set of individuals, group of individuals, and so on. In the complexity of how algorithms are designed, yes, you can look at the chain of command and say that person was ultimately responsible for the deployment of something, but the fact is that individual is not the one who's ultimately responsible for the decision-making on ground. I mean, how many times have we heard, and mostly with drones, that, it was a slight technical error, or the coordinates got wrong. And drones, to their credit or not so, by far, so far they have been used mostly in uncontested airspaces. But once the prevalence increases of these things, I think we have to, sort of be cautious about the rationalization between efficiency in terms of precision versus the notion of moral agency and the notion of life itself, what it causes. Right?
There's also the issue of the controllability of these technologies. As costs fall and the technologies are widely dispersed, just yesterday, the campaign to stop killer robots distributed a frightening video that I would commend to anybody to look at just to understand the scope of the problem. It's called Slaughterbots. And basically, take low-cost, off-the-shelf drones, plastic explosives, and face recognition. And where do you go? You go someplace you really don't want to go. But the question is that technology controllable at all? And that's what I worry most about.
Yeah. No, and I think it's important to be clear that a lot of the questions that are being asked are some of these are age-old questions. And a lot of the arguments that are being made are expressions of concern about going to war, period. And that is a completely legitimate discussion to be having. And if you look at just American history of the last 100 years, there are wars we have gone to that I think most of us would say we had to go, and others that I think most of us would say, why did we do that? So I think that I want to be really clear that never goes away. Now we're layering on these questions that I think open the ability to inflict a lot of damage to a larger number of players and the ability to get those technologies around the world. So I think it accelerates the problem.
It's not just about the age-old questions of things. I think it's also about the scale at which these things are operating. It's one thing for a person to hack a cannon or a sword. You steal it, you operate with it or something. The response of state agencies or anybody is like, we'll just increase the encryption, we'll increase the security. That's constantly undermining the hacking community. Right? And by far, state agencies have failed miserably when they're put against hacking community. And the challenge here is exactly that, which is, on one side you have, individuals who can assemble these things just watching an internet video and deploy it in civic society, but the tools were already designed for them. On the other side, you have, large-scale arsenal, for example, of automated robots and so on, and the presumption that they cannot be hacked. They could be hacked.
That's not the presumption, obviously, because people are very concerned about that.
Right.
I would counter this narrative by just pointing out that even, although it's hard to feel this way when you read the newspaper every day, we actually do live in the safest period of human history. And so I think while our concerns have risen, and these are all very legitimate issues, I think you have to weigh that against the fact that, in fact, things are, for humanity and in aggregate around the globe today, certainly where we sit here in this part of our country, things are pretty darn good, and technology is part of that too. So I want to make sure we don't lose the other side of this.
And I'd like us to get back to the civilian side of this, and not that the military and the war part.
Having solved those problems.
Right. But, I mean, I think there are other areas in which the algorithms are having consequences, work, the biases in algorithms when they make decisions, that really require us to be thinking about how we're going to deal with that. And not just letting technology lead that, which is not a Luddite position. I believe the technology has been incredibly important for advancing our well-being, but it's also time for us to step up as citizens and take some responsibility for it and begin to develop some institutional arrangements to control that. So I'd love to hear you all speak to that question.
You know, being at MIT, I can tell you, I can profess that I'm not anti-technology.
Right. I'm at Stanford. I'm not either.
I mean, people, you know, we do want to design, and we do want to design technology that betters, you know, human condition and things in that way. But part of the challenge is the exponential growth of some of these things that I think, as individuals and as state agencies, behaviorally, you know, we are too slow to adapt. So you take the system, the judicial system kind of thing, right? You know, you have you know, certain key players who are deploying, you know, rating scores for how to judge a criminal, right? How to do profiling. But the facial recognition and other kinds of things are so primitive that, you know, we had a fellow at Media Lab. She got interested in this thing because she was working with one of those systems, and the system wouldn't recognize her face. Then she put her friend there, and the system wouldn't recognize her face. And it turned out the system could not recognize any blacks or Hispanics. You know, so that was one of the first sort of, you know, trigger points. And then part of the challenge became that, you know, you started looking at biased data in judicial systems as to how judges are making these kinds of things. And we know that judges make decisions based on who lost football game the night before, how good their lunch was, that all these things actually affect. You know, yes, ideally we would like to say that should not affect judgment, but it does affect judgment. So when you have a system that they can easily sort of point to, again, it comes to moral agency of things, which is they can easily say, well, the computer told me to do so. The computer did this risk analysis, projected this score, and this is what it is. Now, the challenge is that it's still at an early stage, but there needs to be enough people in the tech community, in the policymaking community, to start saying, no, you cannot deploy this at this stage. Let's come up with better inputs for data sets to be able to then put it in civic society.
I was going to say part of the problem is moral agency, but part of the problem is also bad data that's been, and bad statistical mechanisms for looking at it.
We also have a problem with language. You know, back in the 1980s, I spent about a decade as a reporter trying to defend the term hacker. You know, hacker, as it originated at MIT, was a positive term. But around 1983, largely because of the movie War Games, it became a teenager who broke into computers. And for the longest time, I refused to use the word hacker. And I think we have a similar problem here in the same sense that artificial intelligence has taken us into a sort of a cul-de-sac that we shouldn't be stuck in. You know, artificial intelligence came from this Dartmouth meeting in 1956. If you go back and read, you know, Stanford faculty, John McCarthy, the creator of SAIL, coined the term artificial intelligence. If you read his archives, he picked that term because he didn't want to argue with Norbert Wiener, who had coined the term cybernetics, sending us forever off course. And the problem is that we as a species will anthropomorphize anything. We'll anthropomorphize rocks, we'll anthropomorphize cars, we'll anthropomorphize robots, and we'll anthropomorphize these bits of software we interact with in cyberspace. And I think that's actually a huge problem. And I'm not sure that we can back away from it, but we should. Because these machines they're not intelligent, certainly not intelligent in a biological sense. They're tools. A hammer is a hammer is a hammer, and it's going to be that way as long as all of us are alive, despite what Ray Kurzweil says. I think if we could find our way to different language, everybody knows that airplanes fly without flapping their wings. They do these wonderful things. These machines will do remarkable things. They may not be about humanity and what humans do. And if we could pull this thing apart, I think it would help us a great deal.
Yeah, and I think that the reason I think that is so important is exactly this conversation is that I really worry that when we talk about the they, that is the machine, we're neglecting all the human decisions that are really the issue. Who's developing the technology and how are these machine learning systems being trained on data that is labeled by humans, and in some sense they're distilling all of human bias, and then how are they used? So I think it's important to keep coming back to the people in the equation.
I think that's a very important point in terms of the training mechanism. It's like you look at internet. I don't think the founders of internet had ever envisioned that a platform that they would design to connect people to make society more transparent and flow of information is going to threaten democracy today. Now, the thing is, if you look at the inventors, so to speak, of social media, how many ethicists did they have on their design team? And this is what I mean, is that there's a time when you can have a Volkswagen incident and say, it was an ethical dilemma, some things happened, legal loopholes, let's recall all the cars. It's another thing to say, let's blame Facebook and Twitter. We can't recall election.
Right.
We are going to live with these consequences. That's the challenge. You see, so that's what I mean by the level of scale. How things are approaching. So it becomes a learning lesson for us to not think of ethics in an aftermath, but make ethics the center of design process itself. And to get rid of this idea of ethics as a restraining mechanism. Most times when you talk about ethics, people start to think about, he's going to tell me don't do this, he's going to tell me don't do that. That's outdated things of ethics. Thinking of ethics as optimization in terms of really helping us through. I mean, if most Silicon Valley companies are claiming that they want to design to make people's life better, look at the ethical framework of how you can actually design things for better.
Well, let's explore that a little more, Tenzin and all of us. So it's more than an ethical framework, right? I mean, it's also thinking about what the downstream consequences are likely to be for society and actually understanding or trying to understand some of the scenarios and some of the impacts. And then you bring in so it's not an aftermath, it's part of the same process. But the ethical questions need something to be making an ethical decision about. And I don't think we've fully incorporated into our design process, really thinking about the downstream consequences.
So part of the challenge, I think, when it comes to ethics has to be relevant to particular product and its deployment and how it affects, a particular section of society. The challenge becomes is that if you only have people who are trained in engineering, they might be very good human beings, but if they're simply trained in engineering, or
I agree.
or particular discipline, they are not, they just don't have the tools and capabilities to think what are the 50 different ways they can envision things going differently. So, most of them are concerned about issues of privacy, most of them are concerned about issues of hacking and breaking of encryptions and so on. But you could work around all that system. Okay? And so that's what I mean is it's I know that some of the Silicon Valley companies now are getting interested in liberal arts field and things of that nature, but it needs to be precise. It needs to be targeted. It doesn't need to be, part of the thing that I get wary of, it's like corporate social responsibility kind of gimmick, which is it all becomes a perception issue.
Right, and you just have a code and you check off the boxes.
Exactly. That we have a compliance officer, we have an ethical officer on the team, and that's it. I think that's detrimental to well-being of the technology, the tools that we are developing, and to civic society.
So I think it's an interesting thought experiment. If you could turn the clock back and use this approach in your design framework, how would you develop Facebook differently to avoid
That's a great question. So first thing I would do is I would not match people simply by their interests. Interests are biased interests. I would create options for a healthy community where people are able to have diverse set of conversations. I won't reinforce this echo chamber phenomena of particular opinion sets.
And then, so imagine I'm Facebook. Right. I'll be Mark Zuckerberg in this conversation. I've never gotten to do this before. But so, I want people to...
Would you like to use this as a hoodie?
I don't think that would solve the problem. But, I actually want people to show up, and that's not what they want to show up for. If I want to build my business, I need to go in a different direction. I want to find people that have affinity for each other and that want to hang out together, which is where echo chambers come from. But how do I don't think it's going to be that simple, I guess, right?
No. So,
you got to weave it into...
Here's the thing. So human beings, by nature, are addicts. They're addicted to one thing or the other. And when we create echo chambers, it is addiction to certain kinds of conversations, looking at like-minded individuals, so on and so forth. We cannot eradicate addiction in that regard. But what we can do is switch certain things so that it becomes optimal addiction. So you're not completely sort of becoming addicted to negative things. So the thing is that Facebook was designed as a community-building platform with revenue from advertising industries and so on, right? Which raises 15 different kinds of other issues, whether how legitimate advertising should be in combination with AI and so on. But you can create a community of individuals who can share things with each other, but you are able to sort of prompt them often enough to say, hey, look at this. This is a different point of view. This is a different interest. People are able to do that. Otherwise, everybody is happy in their own small community. What difference does social media make in that regard? You see? So all I'm looking, Facebook in one sentence is tool for self-validation. You see? All the algorithms are designed to simply effectively manage our desire for validation. That's what it is.
So, Facebook, it gets at how hard this problem is and how much harder it's going to be. I mean, Facebook tried to do something with identity that was very important. You can't be anonymous on Facebook. I mean, I think this is the cusp of our problem, though. Even though you can't be anonymous, anonymity is our problem, and it's going to be worse, and it's going to be worse because of this field that we're talking about. There should be no freedom of speech for bots or corporations. Humans should have freedom of speech rights, but we're gonna face that really to a remarkable degree going forward over the next 4 years. And there are no borders. We don't know who's a citizen and who's not a citizen. We don't know increasingly who's a human and who's not a human. And solving that problem of identity, I think, is the one we're going to face. We face right now.
Yeah, I think to me the complexity of this design issue is that it's infinitely iterative, and I completely agree that at the beginning of the design process, it's essential to be thinking about it from many, many more perspectives than just the engineer perspective or just the market perspective. This is something that we worked on a lot when I was at DARPA, whether it was biological technologies or privacy issues with data. And we found it essential to engage in a very different set of conversations, sometimes because it would give my technical brilliant program managers who really understood the technology side a vantage point that they didn't have, but also because sometimes we were seeing where the technology could go before others were really starting to worry about it, and you want people to start to think about those consequences. So you need that iterative process. But to me, it's not prescriptive because the technology, especially in that nascent stage or at the early stage of a business, is so unformed, and it can go in so many different directions. And as it progresses, you really have to keep this back and forth going.
I'm against any form of prescription on this. Let me be clear. I'm not in favor of prescriptive ethics, regardless. You see, but the thing is that you have to expand the bandwidth of critical thinking to be able to ask the right questions that are not just within the framework of engineering or marketing or getting
Absolutely.
all
But I think there's another problem here, which is the question of incentives, which we've only touched on. I mean, we live in a world in which we value technology a lot and let that be developed and see where it goes, and where the whole idea of a Facebook is it has to make a profit. Right? So the incentives are all aligned to not allow what you're talking about. And we have to start thinking about where the leverage points are politically, morally, economically, creating a new kind of political economic framework, a new moral economy that allows us to actually create some leverage points and to think about what the leverage points are that we have now, from government regulations, ham-fisted as they are, to other kinds of professional associations. Where's our entry into this?
I'm not entirely, having watched Silicon Valley struggle with this for, seriously for the last 2 or 3 years, I'm not completely depressed about the outcome. I mean, there is an industry consortium, for example. There are a number of efforts, and there are technical people in this community who are personally concerned about this, who have tried to do things within their corporation. The Partnership for AI is something to watch very carefully to see whether it will be more than, a paper organization. It was created by people who are technical people at the 6 founding corporations, which are 6 key Silicon Valley corporations, who are deeply concerned about this and believe that the companies can do more than just make a profit for their shareholders. So it's a good test case. OpenAI is another. So there, in this field, there are actually real efforts by the technologists to take control of this, and maybe it's possible.
I think that is a very important and positive sign. I mean, I get, my view is none of these are complete by themselves, but that's phenomenally, it's a phenomenal step in the right direction. To me, it reminds me of the biological research and the biotech research communities also trying to grapple, at the moment trying to grapple with gene editing and the power that it's unleashing and trying to self-regulate. I mean, I think these are good moves, and they're not going to solve the whole problem because, number one, you live in a planet with a few billion other people who are operating under whatever rules they choose or whatever they think makes sense. And again, none of this is going to get solved by a group of technologists or a bunch of smart companies or regulations. It's really going to be a recrafting of all of those roles, and for all of us, even as consumers, I think we have to be part of that.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of regulations, partly because I'm not entirely sure how useful they're going to be in the long run. Increasingly, legal teams are becoming more sophisticated to find legal loopholes. We have seen it increasingly, in the last 30, 40 years with these things. I am more optimistic when it comes to framework for a country and government like China, where they decide on something and they're able to execute it. Democratic societies do have certain challenges with just coming up with a framework, and then we spend a number of years trying to figure out what the regulatory framework is going to be. And especially this marriage of AI and CRISPR. Those are things that I am concerned about. It doesn't dampen my enthusiasm for technology, but I am concerned about is whether we'll have proper regulatory frameworks. Where would it come from? Should it come from the companies themselves? Should it come from the government? Where the middle grounds are going to be. And, if it doesn't happen that way, then we also sort of expose ourselves to other vulnerabilities.
We're at a particularly interesting time. The week before last, Kai-Fu Lee, who is now a venture capitalist in China, but was instrumental in creating both Microsoft's and Google's laboratories in China, spoke at MIT on the pace of the Chinese national commitment to artificial intelligence. And in some ways, this may be taken out of our hands. I try to think about, is this another version of the 5th generation project that the Japanese tried to do unsuccessfully several decades ago, or is this something fundamentally different? And, I've been in China in the last year, and it feels like, well, when you step into Beijing in the 3rd ring today, you feel like you're in Silicon Valley. You feel like you're in the midst of an entrepreneurial frenzy. They have a national commitment to catching us in AI in 3 years and being the dominant force globally in 2030. And there's a debate in the United States about how quickly the Chinese are coming. But when you're there, you feel that they're completely serious about being a player in AI. And what's amazing about being in China, in Beijing, in the third ring now, is it feels just like Silicon Valley, except, they don't really care about democracy. Democracy's not really on the table there. It's culturally just like being in Silicon Valley, but there's no interest in democracy, which is really weird. But they've taken some of our technologies. Like, if you go and see how they use WeChat, WeChat is Facebook on steroids, and it's an example how you can be a fast follower. WeChat is used for virtually all commerce in the urban parts of China. It's just remarkable, the uptake. Tremendous interaction that happens on that platform. I mean, it's incredibly powerful, and they control it in a way that's really remarkably interesting. They're not really so much interested in the question of opposition. It's where things disappear out of the Chinese social media is when people are trying to organize anything in opposition. And then when they're doing any organizing, the messages vanish instantly. And they're very frightened of another Tiananmen Square, I think. And it appears to be an effective mechanism of control.
Well, this is what I think is so interesting is, first of all, I'm not really sure what it means that the Chinese are going to beat us at AI. I mean, it is such a broad research field. Its applications feel unbounded sometimes. And so I'm very sure that they and many other parts of the planet are going to be driving the technology forward. I mean, the US had a brief monopoly on everything. Those days are gone. But what's really interesting to me is how we end up using these powerful tools is going to be an expression of what our society values, and it is playing out in some very different ways. The censorship work that you're referring to, I think we were talking about this at lunch today. Actually, Gary King, who's on the board here at CASBS, had with his students did some beautiful research where they were watching. They could watch the posts in real time, so they could see all these social media posts. They could see what went away, and from that they could start testing hypotheses, and from that they concluded it was actually this collective action that was what was being shut down. Right. Criticism per se was not being shut down, which was pretty interesting to see. But in a society, in our society where we value free speech and the freedom of assembly, of all the things that are being proposed right now to deal with the problems with our democracy and social media, what is not being proposed is that the government should control the message on social media. I mean, that's unthinkable. And however bad our problem is, that is not going to be our solution. And so I think, and frankly, I think for a democracy, I've come to this sort of sad conclusion that we're bound to lose the first round in this conflict in the information arena that we're in. I actually think we're going to win in the long run if we don't overreact and walk away from our values. But this first round is very challenging.
What does it mean to win in this particular battle?
Well, I mean, I think that's the first question. But for the United States, I think one thing that it would mean to win is that we find a way to strengthen our democratic system and principles rather than having them be threatened as they currently are.
Tenzin, I'm waiting for you to jump in here, and then I'm going to turn to the audience.
I think there's, I try not to be cynical. I try to be clinical about things. I think, democracy is only useful when it has a self-corrective mechanism built into it. When I was speaking of China, I was speaking of it favorably in the sense that, when we talk about labor displacement in this country, like in the advent of automation and AI, I have investor friends in China who say, Tenzin, you don't understand. If the government decides, fine, you have AI and automation, but you cannot lay off even 500 people a year, companies have to follow that.
Right.
In the US, companies don't have to follow that. In the EU, companies don't have to follow that, right? So the issue becomes is, again, that the role of a government is to cater to the well-being of civic society, of their own citizens itself, right? And the issue becomes that in 200 years of democracy, this is where we are, in the democracy of this country. Yes, we can be hopeful that there will be certain kinds of interventions and so on that, as a civic society, we can look into the mirror. But if you look at the complexity of the battles and the inner battles we are fighting, from racism to poverty level, this is a first world country.
So what's interesting in this discussion is we've had several of these discussions in the last week. You weren't part of two of them. And we end up with democracy out of technology. is where we seem to be going, and the kinds of questions that the current technologies are raising for the democratic way of life or the democratic polity and the democratic government. But I think there's some other questions about technology which are equally important. This is one of the issues that technology is unbearing to us, is some of the limits of democratic practice as we've been practicing it up to now. But it's also, I want to go back to the theme at the very beginning and sort of conclude our part of this discussion with really thinking again about what this technology is doing to how we think of ourselves as humans. What it's doing to how we extract meaning from the kind of work we're doing, how it affects the way we think about each other and think generally. Because I think those are ultimately much more important. Not that I care about democracy. I'm a political scientist. I study it. I work with it. I uphold it to the extent I can. But I do think there are other questions which are equally important right now and are all intertwined with the question of how do we create a decent government and governance system that serves its people. Is that just a concluding statement?
I think that sounds like a concluding statement to me.
I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. Juan, would you introduce yourself? Stand and introduce yourself.
Juan Botero, the World Justice Project.
Who thinks a little bit about law?
Justice in 100 countries. The question is this:
Sorry.
because the good and evil are kind of tricky concepts, right? And around the world, their notions of justice vary significantly. So, what does that implication have for artificial intelligence, and how does the justice is defined when so many different notions of justice are defined by a computer?
I think, again, there are certain fundamental assumptions when we talk about justice, not even entirely in terms of the philosophical or social framework around good and evil, but there are two presumptions. One is there is a sense of fairness, and there's a sense of greater degree of unbiased assessment, and then passing a judgment onto these things. If you have a system that is rigged to be unfair and to be heavily biased, we cannot even go towards moral notions of justice. And that's one of the things that when I talk about, the threat to democracy, it's like, yes, we can say democracy is wonderful. For who? When you have majority of the male members of minority communities in prison here, for who? See, I believe this is a wonderful opportunity for our country, for any civic society, to actually deeply reflect as to what are the things, because we have become very good at addressing symptoms and moving on. That's what we have been doing fundamentally for a number of years. I think this is an opportune moment to deeply think about what do we really want to become as a society, as a civic society, and to deeply look at the implications of that rather than just fixing the symptoms.
And in defense of American democracy, I actually think that is exactly the point, is the American experiment, as imperfect as it is precisely to be valued because it takes on that challenge from one generation to the next, and I think it's a journey that's never done. Clearly, we have a long way to go, but I think that can be done in a country like this.
Well, and the one, an open area of debate right now amongst economists, jobs generally, but also economic justice. It is possible that AI may be fostering inequality in our society. And if that's true, that's another challenge to democracy.
I mean, the thing is that, we haven't even barely scratched the issue of digital divide.
Right.
We have been talking about 2 decades. AI is digital divide on steroids.
Potentially. Potentially.
Yeah.
There was a question way in the back.
Yes.
And then with the microphone, their microphone's wandering around, I believe. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Irina Raiku. I work at the Markla Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, and we are one of 2 ethics centers that have just joined the partnership on AI. So I wanted to mention that the partnership includes not just businesses, but groups like the ACLU and Amnesty International and the EFF and ethics centers at this point. And the whole point is to try to, make this a much broader effort than just, companies trying to regulate themselves. But I wanted to commend you especially for something you said, which was the quote I wrote down is, "We cannot deploy this at this stage." Because I think one of the things that all of us in this room can do is combat the hype around AI and to say exactly, it's something that has wonderful potential as a tool to do a lot of good. But if we start to implement it like we have in sentencing, where we've had it now for years in multiple states doing terrible injustice, and most American citizens don't even know that it's happening, then we're definitely using it for evil, whatever your definition of good and evil is. So the whole notion—
You have a question?
Yes, I'm saying, how can we get more people to do that, to say we cannot deploy this at this stage, to counter the sort of business imperative, which is to say it's all great and we should implement it right now?
Thank you.
Well,
No, I don't, sorry.
go ahead.
I don't think that's the issue. I think deployment should happen. It should happen at a modest scale. It should happen at a scale. The thing is, it's not just about, if we don't deploy it, somebody else will deploy it. And it's very difficult to then, talk to China and Russia and other countries and say, please don't deploy it. I don't think we have that kind of diplomatic relationship yet. So I think it's better to sort of, come up with better frameworks for deployment. I'm a big fan of deployment. It's just a question of in the right framework, with the right targets, and realistically looking at what the challenges might be.
And understanding whether the technology actually is working or not in the example that you cited.
Yeah. The Valley has this religious belief in exponential change, but the reality is very different. And if you go back and look at the history of AI, it's mostly been about overpromise and underdeliver. I mean, go back to 1957 when Frank Rosenblatt invented the perceptron. There was a story in the New York Times that said that machines would read and write within 1 year at the cost of $100,000. 10 years, 5 years later, John McCarthy at Stanford, in his proposal to DARPA, said that there would
And
be—
a fellow of the center.
Wow, that's great.
said that there would be thinking machines in a decade.
We never got hyperbole in proposals during my time, so that's shocking.
Papert and Minsky, they gave Gerald Sussman the problem of machine vision as a summer project. Ray Kurzweil conveniently thinks that thinking machines are still a decade in the future. The problem is Hollywood, I think, is we really sort of believe.
Well, those are all technologists that you rattled off. That wasn't Hollywood.
Well, there's this wonderful, one of the things that I stumbled across when I was working on my last book is how many AI pioneers were actually basically brought into the field of robotics and artificial intelligence by seeing 2001: Space Odyssey. They saw how, and they had a very different reaction.
Apparently, right.
But I don't think we should undermine the amount of funding. I think the funding going into these kinds of work is radically much higher than what happened in the 60s.
Absolute best thing about Silicon Valley. One of the things about the Valley that makes it so effective is it can pivot on a dime. And so if you looked in 2010, 2011, the entire Valley was focused its venture funding on social media. And now it has shifted and it's all on machine learning, and there's almost no investment at all in social media. So, and most of the firms fail, and there are a couple of winners. That's the best thing about the Valley.
And something else happens. There's always another one coming.
Hi, I'm Carrie Chihawk, and I'm a fellow here at the center, and my home institution is at King County, Washington, in Seattle. And the conversation that's happening up here is a great example of why it's such an amazing place to be a fellow. But I wanted to go back to Margaret's question, really, about how these technologies are intermediating our human relationships. We wake up with them, we go to sleep with them, they're in our house.
Unless you're Arianna Huffington, she puts them to bed separately.
Well, and I was going to say, and we even have technologies now to help us stay away from our technologies. we have new beings in our house that are interacting with us all the time. Our children think of those technologies as people. There are people behind there. So I wanted to maybe get your thoughts about the impacts that that's having on our human relationships and what the implications are for us in that and what we should be doing about it, if anything.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very interesting observation. And again, I mean, whenever I'm with a bunch of engineers, I'm always the one that's saying, but wait, look at all the problems. And with this crowd, I have to be the optimism, I guess. So, I mean, the fact is, technology actually is changing our relationships in ways that I think are quite constructive. I mean, I know it sounds trivial, but I love being able to see, my cousin's babies on Facebook. That actually is something that has changed relationships in my family in a way that's meaningful to me. The connection I have with my college-age daughters is so different than when I left home. So, and I think it's easy to overlook those because they just become seamlessly part of our lives. My wish, to answer your question, would be that we are conscious of this shifting nature of the relationship we have with each other because of the ways that technology is mediating that, and that we make more deliberate choices. And I think it's very easy to just sort of slip into it and spend all day looking at your smartphone or take for granted how nice it is. You can FaceTime with your college kids. Either way, you shouldn't be taking it for granted, I think.
Yeah, and there's one.
May I just say briefly one thing is that, as a Buddhist monk and also as a human being, my primary interest is whether humans are becoming happier, whether human beings are becoming more joyful, whether human beings are becoming more introspective or reflective that contributes to this conducive sense of well-being. And in the short and long term, the issue becomes whether technology or a set of technologies are aiding that process or not. And the very fact that human relationships traditionally were those sounding boards that informed us more about ourselves, about our emotional states, about our values and things of that nature. The issue becomes, whether technology helps amplify that or whether it is going to completely deflate that process. At the end of the day, issue becomes, is it making you more happier or not?
John, and then there are a bunch of questions out here.
Just quickly, because Microsoft really sort of stepped in it with the creation of this chatbot called Tay, which originally immediately became a misogynistic, sexist device and created all kinds of problems. But they did something else in China where they created a similar program called Xiaoai's Little Bing. It was immediately adopted by a young demographic of 13 million users almost overnight. It was not like Siri. It was designed to have an extended set of conversations. The average amount of interaction with it was 60 interactions a day. A young demographic of 13 million young users. They would go into the bathroom. They called it toilet time. 25% of them texted "I love you" to it. And the Microsoft people were kind of freaking out because it was kind of creepy to the American eye. And I ran into an IBM Chinese researcher who had a very different interpretation about what was going on, to the point of cultural relativism. And her argument is, when the Chinese come to America, they feel that we're in this very Spartan world. We don't have much social interaction relative to the Chinese. To her mind, what this was for the young Chinese is this was a chance to have a private space to be alone with their own thoughts. And that sort of made me rethink it, which something that was freaking me out. So it's just sort of hard to pick these things apart and understand what they're happening. But I think the dividing line is that we keep our human independence, and where we start to lose independence, I mean, the Borg, resistance is futile, you will be assimilated. We're being increasingly surrounded by this soup of algorithms that are offering us life choices. And that's what I think is the line where we have to draw it, is if we have AR glasses, you have to be able to take them off, which is not in the realm of science fiction. You guys are working on things where you can't take it off.
We did that a long time ago. But now it just has to be turned into something real.
But the question that you're raising, John, is really, we don't understand what these things are doing. So it's not just a question of figuring out the right design at the beginning. It's also, as things unfold, really investigating their consequences, and then the iterative process comes into play. Sorry, I don't want to talk because there are a million questions. Here's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. You have to wait for the microphone.
Sorry.
Henriette Skowitz, Triple Helix Institute. The change in Silicon Valley venture capital decision-making has been mentioned, but I'd like to ask Ariti to open the black box of DARPA a bit for us and discuss the interaction between the military sponsors, the program officers, and what you saw about any changes in DARPA decision-making during your time there. For example, is there ever anything technically sweet, to use the Oppenheimer metaphor, that isn't done?
Thank you.
There's a long list of things that aren't done for various reasons. So let's see. I think the core of your question is the relationship between our little agency and which is embedded in this monstrously large, world's largest bureaucracy, which has this defense mission, and how does that drive decision making? So yeah, okay. So that's a question I can answer. DARPA was created in the wake of Sputnik. Sputnik was 60 years and 1 month ago, and of course, in the panic that ensued afterwards, that was the time. You know, if you think about it, we had started to build this federal R&D system that we have today post-World War II. We had the National Science Foundation. We were expanding the National Institutes of Health. We had R&D and real research in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. Sputnik comes along a decade later, and that was a real signal to the Defense Department that we needed a place that didn't just go work on the problems that we knew we had, but a place whose day job was to think about technologies or capabilities that would be surprising, and we didn't want to be surprised anymore. Sputnik was not a pleasant surprise in a national security sense. And that event that was the spark that created DARPA, that spirit has stayed true in that agency now for 6 decades. And as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of DARPA having delivered on its mission of creating technological surprise for a number of decades, I found that it was, I went back to DARPA in 2012 as the director. I'd been there 2 decades earlier as a program manager and office director. But throughout the time that I had been involved with that agency, what I saw was a place that was given enormous rope, enormous autonomy by the Defense Department, by the White House, by Republicans and Democrats in Congress. And, you know, it's the usual thing. First you think, I have all this freedom, and then you realize, oh my gosh, now I have all this responsibility. I actually have to figure out what we need to go do. And the answer for DARPA about what really drove the research agenda was our 100 or so technical program managers. And so we spent a lot of time going out and finding people who were deeply steeped in their technology, but who could think about how to turn that into huge impact and who wanted to drive an area of technology forward, not in an incremental way, but in a revolutionary way. And then we would turn those people loose to go out and see what was brewing in research, see what the problems of the world were, and then they would come back, sometimes with military systems prototypes that were very practical and directly relevant to DoD, but sometimes, obviously, with core enabling technologies that we knew were going to be important to DoD, but that also, as history has shown, have had a huge impact on the information revolution, and I think in the future in other areas as well. So that really having that room and then enabling a bunch of really smart, creative people to be bottoms up in their planning of the research agenda is a long-standing successful recipe at DARPA.
There's a question back there.
Hi. My name is Steve Ash. I'm a professor in the medical school in primary care. And a lot of my colleagues are afraid that they're going to get replaced by AI, just like a lot of people in a lot of different industries. And I always tell them that, well, there's something about the human interaction, caring, that probably isn't going to be replaced anytime soon. And then I thought of, Tenzin, your comment that what we really want is to be happy. And I thought of my son, who wants to be a psychologist. And 30 years from now, when he's my age, will he be replaced by an AI? And what advice would you give my son or other people who want to do something that AIs can't?
So I think there's a lot of things that AIs can do, and I don't see in the foreseeable future them doing that well. But you raise an important issue here, which is that, it's an opportunity for us to rethink certain institutions, especially learning institutions that haven't been revamped for the last 100 or 200 years. So yes, I can envision the entire medical curriculum to be changed, where certain expertise, and this is where I like the Media Lab approach to artificial intelligence, not referring to it as artificial intelligence, but as extended intelligence, where the medical community can rely on AI in the surgery room to give certain precision data, but the sense of care that the AI or the robots cannot do, or maybe it will change in 2 generations and people feel more trusting to robots, as some of the data is showing. But so far, if we can extend that sense of care, but again, that requires a complete revamp in the medical curriculum. That requires a complete revamp in teaching curriculum. So these are the areas that I'm hopeful about with AI. I think it would help, hopefully, get to a state globally in terms of education and medical adaptability in terms of providing medical care in an unprecedented manner. But we need to train the teachers, we need to train the medical professionals not to compete with AI. See, because that has been our mindset. When calculators came and computers came, we used to take pride in who's going to compute faster than the other thing. But come to the stage that it's extended intelligence. There are some things it's designed to do better, more efficiently.
But there's another piece of the education system, which is it's not just training somebody to be something anymore. It's really going to have to require a capacity to be flexible, to engage in critical thinking, to have to reskill regularly, and that requires a whole superstructure of education and funding and other things that we're just on the cusp of really thinking about.
And also, you're sort of buying into the notion of no jobs in 30 years. And I just think that's, there was an Oxford study in 2013 that said, almost 50% of human jobs were subject to automation. It was just wrong. And it set us off in this wrong direction. What I think the consensus in the technical and economics community is that there's a lot of task automation. There's not so much job automation. If you go and look at the OECD study of a year ago, it has a very different outcome, and that is that about 9% of the jobs in all of the OECD countries, 21 countries, are at risk. And in fact, if you want to feel even better, go look at Jim Besson's work that shows that there's actually a positive correlation between degree of automation and job growth in all these categories. And so there's something else going on that we haven't gotten on, but I don't think that we have to be afraid that all the jobs are going to disappear overnight.
Well, I think there'll be new kinds of work, and that's really what we've got to think about, not just, we do know that automation does replace certain kinds of jobs, and that's always been true.
But we're really good at predicting what jobs are going to go away. We're not so good at
But some we are, John, as we know. We know that certain kinds of caring labor is going to be required for an awful long time. Education, healthcare, elder care, all those kinds of things still, things that aren't necessarily highly valued
I think it goes
monetarily or by society.
I think it goes back to, the term that you used earlier, the expression. We have to rethink economy. We have to think of
moral economy.
Because if you're just going to talk about in terms of efficiency, yes, there'll be jobs. Are they going to be as well paid? Yes, there are all kinds of arguments around this. New experiments on, what is it called? Basic income.
Universal basic income.
UBIs and all this thing. Are you underestimating human greed? Are you underestimating the level of discontentment that humans face? So all these things sound wonderful, and it might work for a tiny segment of certain kinds of population and civic societies, but they cannot become the templates for things. So the thing to do would be to start thinking about how can we strengthen things that human beings are actually good at.
There was a question in the back, and then I think that may be the last question. Yeah, you. Well, whoever Sarah gives the microphone to gets the question.
I'm Eugene Fram. I'm Professor Emeritus from Rochester Institute of Technology. I'd like to ask a very practical question. You have people, as you know, in their 30s and 40s and perhaps 50s that will never work again. What do you do with that population? How can we handle that problem, which was a problem that's present at the current time?
I think the
that's a
closest
stumper.
policy person is next to us.
I'm pointing to all of you as being much closer to
I think
solutions to that.
this is exactly where I want to counter some of the optimism of things, which is, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist, and I'm not an idealist in that regard either. You see, the thing is that we made the same arguments to Midwest of United States, in the 50s and 60s, acquire new skill sets, and you will have a job, you'll be happy. Some could not acquire it. We called them lazy or outdated. Some did acquire it, but couldn't fit into the system very well. They didn't want to leave families in the Midwest behind and other places and so on. The current generation will again have to face similar kinds of choices. But the thing is that we might run out of options in terms of what acquiring new skill sets means in the long term, because the job market, the job economy actually is geared towards efficiency and task management for the most part. We don't pay high salary to visionaries. We pay high salaries to executioners. So you have to be, that's why I think we need to think about a new framework of moral economy, moral currency.
Thank you. That's our big project at CASBS, is moral economy. I think we have time for one more question. Why don't we take up front, right here.
Thank you. My name is Colleen Chen. I'm a professor.
Colleen, could you stand up?
Oh, sure. Colleen Chen. I'm a professor at Santa Clara Law School. And just to end on a light note, I was wondering if, John, you had sort of talked about it a little bit, but others as well, if you could unpack the mechanisms by which you think AI may increase inequality or serve as a compression factor in a positive way to actually decrease it.
Well, so the standard argument, the standard argument is that big data is an advantage, and those who control data will have a super advantage, which leads towards concentration. That a few big players will have, and also, there is the revenue per worker in an AI company can be just remarkable, and so these are generating vast amounts of cash. Maybe I should.
That's corporate inequality, but what about wage inequality, or just really thinking about the structure of...
I don't know that I have a specific answer to that question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be related to the last question. I do worry that this is really good for all of us in this room, and we're living this hot time in technology in general and AI in particular. But the divisions in society, I hate to end on a negative note too.
Well, I'm going to make it more negative.
I mean, I think these are not, to me, these are not technology questions. These are fundamental social questions that we're going to have to grapple with as a country. So
what we know is that in the 1970s in this country and a little later in Europe and elsewhere, the gap between, it used to be that productivity and wages were tightly connected, and now they've gone totally disconnected. That's not corporate. Those are people who are getting wages. I mean, corporates are the employers. And that's a failure of policy, and it's a failure of intervention, and it's a failure of government, but it's also something else that I feel strongly about, which is that we've lost a lot of the intermediary associations, which used to, like labor unions, like moderate churches in many places, like the PTA, that used to advocate and used to make sure that productivity and wages, to give that example, continued to be linked. So as we lose those intermediate associations, it also has implications for democracy and other things. But that's something we can actually do something about. That's a solvable problem. It just requires imagination and effort. Get Barack Obama back as a community organizer as opposed to president. But we need to have more community organizers. We need to be thinking about new forms of organizations that can really be the intermediaries. And I'm going to have to stop on that note because we promised we would stop exactly at 1:15, and it is. And I want to apologize to all of you who didn't get to ask your questions, but thank all of you for coming.
thank you.